Good afternoon or good morning, everybody, and welcome to another FinTech Nexus webinar. My name is Peter Renton, Chairman and co-founder of FinTech Nexus, and we have a fascinating discussion on tap for the next hour or so. We are going to be talking about building trust, identity verification strategies in the world of deepfakes and AI, because we do live in a very different world than just 5 years ago, and that has profound implications on identity verification and how you can build trust. We have a couple of experts joining us here today. Now, just one quick note. John Lynch from Avant, who you see on the screen there, he had a last-minute thing come up at work. He had to deal with, so he will not be joining us. But we still have two great speakers today, and we're going to start with some introductions. Tim, why don't you go first?
Sure. I'm Tim Brown. I'm work for Prove Identity. I'm global identity officer for Prove. I'm responsible for sort of forward-looking strategy for identity, concerned about things like deepfakes and where identity verification is going to be taking us. I'm also responsible for managing our product, the platform, specifically our identity and authentication platform at Prove.
Okay, Jason.
Good to be here, guys. I'm part of the founding team at Mission Lane and currently the head of data science and machine learning engineering.
Okay, then with that, and I wanted to also say that I want to thank Prove for sponsoring this webinar, making this possible. We are going to get right into it now, and let's just talk about deepfakes. And maybe, Tim, I'll start with you. What are the different kinds of deepfake attacks that are happening today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we when we start talking about deepfakes, I think a lot of people immediately go to things that we're seeing in the news, that everybody's seeing in the news. I would say things like worried about videos coming out of certain areas that are they accurate, or are they with the presidential election looming, I think we're all concerned about the truth and that we're seeing on TV or being fed to us by media. I think about when I think about deepfakes, and what keeps me up is I'm really focused on things like deepfaking document verification, or deepfaking audio that's coming in to enable that's tricking onboarding into my bank account, things like that, or deepfaking my face so it can get past biometric checks. Those are the types of things I'm really worried about. And there have been some pretty high profile instances of this in the last 6 to 8 months. Specifically, there was the event in Hong Kong where I believe it was on a Zoom call that somebody was convinced to transfer something like $25 million out of their bank, the company's bank account, thinking they were talking to their CFO in the Zoom. Drilling down a little bit, there was some fairly high profile news about onboarding into cryptocurrency accounts using deepfaked driver's licenses, things like that. Those are the things that kind of keep me up at night when I'm thinking about deepfakes.
Okay. So Jason, at Mission Lane, is this an issue for you guys today, or not yet?
Well, it's certainly an emerging attack vector. The quality and sophistication of computer vision based attacks, some of it via AI or generative AI techniques, as Tim was saying, for document forgeries, being one that probably isn't talked about as much, but is equally important to the ones that I think more frequently talk about: video, images, and audio.
Okay. So maybe we could talk about weaknesses of traditional verification methods. Like, we're talking obviously selfies, liveness detections. How do deepfakes exploit these weaknesses, Tim?
Sure. So I think when we talk about selfie and document verification, there's a whole industry that's built up around determining whether or not a selfie capture it's capturing an image from a person who's alive, who's actually in front of the camera, not being fed video or something like that, or a person wearing a mask. I've seen some of the the stock that some of these companies have. They have thousands of masks that they present to try to fake out these liveness detection techniques. Similarly, with document verification, you have a lot of fake documents that are being created, exploiting some of the weaknesses in doc verification because let's be honest, when you're trying to capture a document from a single source, a single light source, like from a mobile phone, you're only able to capture security features in a single light wavelength. At least in the United States, our driver's licenses are designed with the idea that we can embed security features in white light, UV, and IR on the document. So when you walk through a TSA checkpoint or something like that, the scanners are actually looking at all three of those. When you reduce that down, capturing it from a mobile device, you're basically cutting the security features in by a third, or by 2/3 actually, it opens up an attack surface that's greater because those are easier to replicate, especially when you're presenting when you're designing video or video injection in a way that can spoof typical movement, kind of light reflections and things like that make it feel like it's alive. Similar for face, the technology is getting so good that you're starting to see a lot more attacks in that space where the video. I follow somebody on LinkedIn who works for one of the universities in the South United States, who is an expert in fraud and tracks the dark web for this type of activity. And what amazes me is some of the video technology that's being deployed in this space that takes a video of an individual live from the camera and then translates it into an image that's what they're trying to come across as in attacking a victim. It's the quality that it's happening with the lack of delay. All of those things are just, it's pretty phenomenal to see in action. And it makes it, and I worry that this is an ever escalating attack vector, right? It's only going to get better and better. It's not like we're ever going to see, oh, well, we finally reached the apex of
Right.
deep fakes.
Right. So then, how does prevent deepfake fraud from being an issue?
So, I suspect when people think about deep fakes and preventing them, they're going about it in a more they're thinking about it more traditionally. Can I look at the video and tell whether it's true or real? I know there's some great companies out there that I've talked to a number of times that actually will process video and try to pair it up with like geolocation and the events that are happening outside of that to say, okay, this is real or it's not. Prove doesn't actually look at the content of the material content of the video or the audio that's coming across. That's not exactly what we do. We think about deep fakes more about we're offering the secure process or the secure device that's capturing that in the first place. So as an example, let's say I'm onboarding into my bank account. I'm doing so from my mobile phone. So I'm capturing a picture of me and my driver's license, and I'm submitting that into the bank. Now, traditionally, there's been a lot of publicity over the last couple of years around things like injection attacks, or been more recently this whole conversation about deep fakes that looks at, hey, given an unsecured mobile device, right? That's a mobile device, you can't see it. It's in my background. Given an unsecured entry point, what can I do as an attacker to it? So if Peter, if you're trying to fake me and I don't take into consideration how secure that device is, and I simply allow you to capture your face in a fake document, or capture a fake image of me in a fake document on your device to assert that you are me, we're missing a valuable opportunity to prevent that from occurring. So what Prove does is we look at the device, we make sure that it's actually in your hands, through a variety of different signals, some of which we get from like the mobile operators. They'll say, this is this particular phone number. We look at things like, when was the last time the SIM has changed? Because most of these attacks that are happening that are asserting themselves as me as an individual are happening post SIM swap attack. That's something else that's happened in the flow. So we look at, like, has the SIM been swapped recently? Are there any other signals or behaviors that we would think are unusual that would make us not actually trust that device? And once we get past that, and let's say I'm capturing my face in my document, I have that specific information that I'm asserting from that document. Now I can go and bounce it against a variety of different ownership sources, like bank grade ownership sources, where I say, I've got I've got a phone number that I know is actually the device that's connected to the operator. We trust it because it hasn't any SIM swaps or any other signaling data that would prevent us from trusting it. And now I've just shown that at multiple sources, that phone number is attached to the data that we're asserting during the document capture. And it turns out that that's actually a valuable way to kind of secure that channel of providing data. So talk about, like, consider the Zoom instance. Had those individuals who are on those calls been bound to a Zoom account, and then been required to somehow authenticate from their mobile device to get into it, they could have had little blue check marks on their Zoom account, so that would have guaranteed their authenticity. Or if I'm onboarding for a driver's license flow, if you're using proofs technology, then you're basically securing that channel, and you're providing a way for us to, you're avoiding the problem by securing the channel rather than giving the attacker the ability to inject a bunch of data at random, or at will, really, to say that they're, to push in deepfake video that's asserting it to be Tim.
Interesting. So it's all about kind of, it says, securing the device, secure whatever channel you're working with, rather than
Exactly.
trying to kind of, because that makes sense to me. So
I mean,
Jason,
at the end of the day, the like I said earlier, the battle with deepfake video and audio will continue to escalate until it's just it's impossible for you to tell, right? And
right.
so the best way to do it is to kind of look at and secure the channel that you're dealing with.
Interesting. So let's go to Jason, who's on the front lines. Obviously, your people are signing up at Mission Lane for for credit cards and what have you. Are you, like, maybe you could just comment on what Tim just said there? Is that sort of a similar approach to what you guys have, or what is the approach at Mission Lane?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a couple parts with what Tim said that really resonate with me, right? One part of this is that so much of fraud and financial services is this spy versus spy game of, right, we come up with a way of detecting, oh, like, this is a fraudulent image. Then, right, fraudsters come up with a way to beat it. Oh, let's look back to the device and see if we can detect whether this is video injection. Okay, now we know, right? And fraudsters come up with a way of defeating it. So it always does go back and forth. And similar to how Tim was mentioning, right, we're looking at the device, we're talking to the telecom company, and we're wondering what the operator knows about this device. We're working with the bank, and we're kind of triangulating all these pieces of information. That is conceptually the exact same thing that Mission Lane is doing. It's I would call it like a defense in depth sort of approach of saying, we're looking at a lot of different data sources and verification methods, and looking at the consistency and credibility of all these together to try to understand whether this is the true name person, the person who really owns that identity, or is more likely to be fraudulent. And then if it is, what other escalation methods can you take to try to verify that?
Okay. And then in our call we had last week, you talked about making your company unattractive and uneconomical for fraudsters. So you don't have to actually, like, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to make it uneconomical. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that, expand on how you're doing that.
Yeah, and really that is uneconomical is a good way to put it, because at the end of the day, that is really kind of the nature of this adversarial competition that we're engaged with fraudsters, which is as Tim and I are talking about, all these systems can be beaten. It's not a question of whether someone can do or not. Fraudsters are professional and experts, and this is their day job in the same way it's mine or Tim's. They work at this every day. They get better at it every day, just like we do. And so I know that all these methods can be beaten. what we are trying to do as a company are two things. One, customer experience is so important to us, right? We want to have as little friction as possible or no friction for people who are really who they say they are. And so, right, that is one challenge. And then the other challenge is how do you make it expensive? How do you make sure that uh, to the extent that the combination of these methods can be beat, that you have to spend more time and effort in beating all these methods than you could possibly get back through financial crime.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Yeah, and if I could add on to that, I think it's really interesting because if you stop and consider, let's say you're not using a technology like ours that sort of can secure those channels and prevent this, the ability to scale becomes a lot easier. Most people use their email to log in into their bank accounts or when they're creating accounts. It's one of a few emails that are probably well known on the dark web. So if I have the ability and the time to scale an attack across a large block of emails where I can start to generate all this data, these fake videos and things like that, and try to attack it. Given the availability of the tools that are out there, that is much easier to do. But if you start doing things like, let me do a possession check to make sure this phone is where I think it should be. Let me make sure that phone hasn't been SIM swapped. You're starting to put up those roadblocks that slow the attacker down and make it very difficult. So now you have to go out and farm out hundreds of different SIM phones with different SIM cards that you've just gone through and done a mass SIM swap attack, which adds a layer of complexity into the flow, and those things just start to slow things down. That doesn't mean they won't get those attacks, right?
And if you start to scale the attack and try to really brute force these things, right, then fraudsters have another problem to deal with, which is right now you're right creating anomalous behavior, right? The volume, the location, right? There's yet another part that you have to figure out how to mask if you want to scale and be aggressive in these attacks.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so if you have a question for our experts here, hit the Q&A button. We will get to those later in the hour. But Tim, I want to turn back to you and talk about trust. The title of this session is about building trust. So maybe you can talk about what are the important factors to build trust during the identity verification process.
Wow, that's that is an expansive question, right? I think you know, at heart, I'm a consumer transparency advocate. I love it when when I'm being onboarded and I'm being explained what's happening in very plain kitchen English. So I understand it. I think that goes a long way to establishing that initial trust with an individual. I want to know you as a bank or as a e-commerce site or what have you, how you intend to use my data, and what you're intending to do. I think there are a good reason why there are laws that are on the books or coming on the books to protect the consumer. So I think trust starts from there, from coming from a point of view that's saying, how do why we're doing these things? We're doing these things to protect you as a consumer. What are you doing? These are the things that I'm doing, and why we're protecting your data, how we're protecting your data. So that's where I think starting there. I think trust also is, how can the bank or relying party trust the data that they're seeing? That's a big part of this conversation. From our technology perspective, working very hard to be able to secure the endpoint that's capturing, and we've been talking a lot about that. Making sure that there's very little friction involved, that it's not magical, but it provides as an experience to the end user that they feel like, hey, I haven't had to stand on my head and stand on my one foot and turn my head and cough and those kinds of things. I think the user friction can become painful and embodies a certain amount of untrustworthiness into it, or at least poisons the well a bit. I don't know. There's a variety of different ways to answer that, and I think depending on who you're talking, which end you're talking about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Jason, then maybe you can talk about like your approach to building trust when someone's coming to Mission Lane for the first time, and they have to, they're putting information for getting a loan or a credit card. What are the things you're doing right at that initial point to build trust?
Yeah, so when you think about somebody showing up to Mission Lane and applying for credit cards, right, part of what we're going to try to show on our site and message or things about what we're doing from a network and site perspective, um, to um, make sure that the consumer knows that we are taking care of that data. In general, though, the rabbit hole goes very deep there, right? In the sense that as a consumer financial company, this is essentially the primary focus of our InfoSec program is how do you defend consumer data, and that runs the whole gamut of things from network security, which are things that I think consumers are more familiar with, to how we handle encryption, device security, access control, credentials, how are you monitoring, penetration testing, all those sorts of things are part of what we do in order to protect that data. But a lot of that work are things that wind up being discussions that feed into different certifications that we might get as a business, different regulatory relationships, and things like that, and are things that consumers can find and dig into if they're educated and interested in that space. But otherwise, we're trying to give a, uh, a sense of simple security without forcing people to understand more than they want to, right? We want the information available, but not overwhelm people, right? As most people who are working with us as a service are primarily there to focus on their financial needs rather than learn about information security.
Right, right. So then maybe you could talk about tools, and look at the kind of the other side of the equation here, and that is, you want to mitigate losses, you want to sort of improve your fraud prevention. What are some of the types of tools that you're using there?
Yeah, so we use quite a lot of tools to do this, and right, some of these things are internal, some of them are we're working with vendors and companies like Prove. We're working with data consortiums, and we're working with customers and consumers directly as well. At the end of the day, as much as you might think like, oh well, lending companies or vendors or even consumers and a corporation might not normally be on the same side of an issue, right? This is one where it is negative for everyone who is not a fraudster. And so it enables a lot of trust and data sharing between those groups. And so the sources are manifold. And then within those sources, the things that we're looking for and the tools that we're using are some of these topics that we're touching on, like network. We want to know how we are connecting to consumer as best as possible, over whatever electronic means of communication. We want to know about devices, right? What is that device? We want to know about the consistency of the identity information, right? If somebody comes onto Mission Lane and sees the certifications that we have from a security perspective, and that they're transmitting over HTTPS over a credible website, and decides to enter the application information, right? We want to check what the consistency of that information is. Like, does that name and that social security number, that date of birth, do these things all go together? And the credibility of that information, right? Have other people seen that email address, that IP address, that device address, that network connection before, right? Are those things credible? You can also look at how people behave, right? Whether that's from a biometric perspective or a pathing perspective, right? It's all this, kind of mosaic of pieces of data that, well, yes, each one of these tools has a name, and different people and corporations or experts who are best at it. It is that set of tools that then allows us in a low friction, hopefully good customer experience way to be able to mitigate losses and prevent fraud.
Okay, well let's talk about friction then for a second, because obviously there's we need to have some friction in the process here. Maybe Tim, I'd like to start with you. And what when you are talking with Prove clients and they're trying to balance sort of good friction with a good user experience, or relevant friction with a good user experience, what are some of the best practices that you're seeing?
Another interesting question. So we Prove prides itself on providing frictionless onboarding experiences. We have one particular product called Prefill that has enjoyed a whole lot of success in the United States by doing so. Right? It basically is, you show up with your device at a website, you're applying, let's say you're applying for a credit card or opening an account. We do our possession checks, and we check the reputation of the device. Then we ask a simple challenge question, or really it's like a tiebreak question, like give me your last four of your social, your date of birth, which introduces a little bit of friction. But then we go fetch the identity data to help pre-fill your account. That turns out that can be done rapidly with very little user interaction. And you compare that to something like, hey, go find your driver's license. Oh, I'm sorry, that's in another room. I've got to go get up and go walk over to get that. Now I got to capture it. The overhead light in my office is terrible. It's, I've got or old school LED lighting or something like that that's causing issues with the reflection on the driver's license. So I'm here tilting it, trying to capture. I have a funny story about that because I used to work for a doc verification company, and we would demo, and a lot of times in the demos you go into an office building with terrible office overhead lighting, and you'd find yourself trying to capture a document, and I had an older Florida driver's license, and I would have to just casually drop it down below the edge of the table or something to stop the overhead lighting from reflecting on it to get a strong capture. So those are the kinds of friction that like some of these other techniques can do. So if you consider that, plus the selfie, plus the liveness detection, let me turn my head, let me try to prove that I am who I am, all that introduces a lot of friction. So when we go to market and we compete head to head with these types of onboarding solutions, we're very successful. And the cool thing about it is, not only is it successful, but the same technology that I was talking about earlier that we could use to attack the deepfake problem, actually turns out that when you're doing an onboarding experience like that, you can have some very, very high success rates, like in the mid-90s range, with a very low fraud rate. So we have customers that have done this, that have been using us at scale, 90 million transactions going through and they're seeing 93 to 95% success with like 3 to 5 basis points of fraud, which is really, really something when you stop and you think about some of the false acceptance and rejection rates of some other techniques that are out there. Now, there are technologies that are required if you're going to the reg tech space or something like that, you're in healthcare or you're in the government space and you're trying that those mandate the use of some more high friction technologies like doc verification. But for doing onboarding and things like that, I feel like we've really knocked it out of the park when it comes to doing it with very, very little user interaction. And we're continuing to refine that through some of the network effects and a lot of the other signal data that we collect to even reduce that friction even more, to remove almost all the consumer interaction out of there, except for, hey, we want to let you know what we're going to do, and here's what we're going to do for you and why it's going to be good. It avoids fat fingering and things like that.
Right. Okay. Jason, then when you're introducing friction, how do you approach it there how do you approach the tension between user experience and friction?
Yeah, that's probably the most difficult aspect of application fraud in particular for us, in the sense that we're trying to have as little friction as possible throughout the whole process. And so the toughest point is to decide whether to introduce friction or not.
Right.
Generally the method that we would normally take in order to try to make that decision is we are going to try to use all of the information that a customer has to provide us in order to apply for our product or work with us, and all the information that they can share with us, even if that's passive sharing through bureaus and data consortiums and their network connection, and by virtue of working through our devices. And through that set of information, that's what we're going to use to decide either everything here looks so clean and so consistent and so credible that we're good and we're going to keep moving forward, or there are one or more aspects of this that elevate the risk to a level that we think that we need to introduce friction. And we do need documentation, or we need driver's license or video verification or something else in order to understand if this person is who they say they are.
And what's really interesting about that, I specifically mentioned a customer that's doing this at scale for us. One of the reasons why they're seeing such low fraud rates is a lot of we believe a lot of the fraudsters are being routed into alternative mechanisms because they can't get past some of the initial checks. Like when I go to do a possession check to figure out what phone number that I'm interacting with, the fraudster can't beat that. And so they either opt out of the process, and then which routes them into more something that's sort of in Jason's wheelhouse for evaluating a bunch of other signals to try to determine it. And that's where we see a lot of our success, because we're basically separating the wheat from the chaff, and it's the fraudsters are trying to find alternative methods to go about to try to beat the system, and then other funneling techniques happen to try to reduce that even more.
Okay, before we go to audience questions, I want to talk about emerging threats, things that are just we've talked about deepfakes, but it's not the only emerging threat that is here. I mean, how can lenders and others safeguard against emerging threats, Tim?
Buy our software.
Okay.
Oh,
okay.
Sorry, I couldn't resist a shameless plug. I'm sure Jason's going to say the same thing. No, it's really interesting. I was talking about this recently. I was actually at our customer event we had a few weeks ago, and we were talking about, specifically we were talking about deepfakes. I was discussing video and audio deepfakes, and audio, there are technologies that I think you as you start to look at the vectors that are coming in, you have to start thinking about what's available from an authentication perspective that's out there. Things like, can I issue I don't know, things like passkeys, for instance, passwordless authentication. Can I bind an identity to a passkey and then reuse that in certain in specific vectors that are coming in, like access points into my bank, things like call centers, IVRs, those types of things. Think a little bit outside the box when it comes to that. How can I apply the tools in my toolbox right now to try to attack those? And we can certainly help with that. I also just think there's a level of consumer understanding that has to be that we all have to be advocating for in this industry. Just making speaking about it often and saying it out loud. My family thinks I'm insane, but I have we have a safe word in our family that if like my son picks up the phone and calls me and says, "Hey Dad, I was in an accident. Tow truck driver needs $1,000 to tow our cars away. I don't have my lost my wallet, blah, blah, blah. I had to borrow somebody else's phone, and it sounds like him, but it's not, I would ask for a safe word, right? And those types of things that's more of a shift towards consumer education that I think is necessary. I read about this all the time. I have friends that have fallen prey to fraudsters, whether it's romance scams or whatever the consummate Nigerian prince scam, right? The scary part about all this is that they are getting much, much better. It's no longer emails that have 100 typos in it that are quite obviously a fake. They are well scripted, using graphics that look like the real thing, getting phone calls from places that are doing spoofing of the phone numbers to make it look like it's coming from your bank. It's funny, I bought a smoothie earlier for lunch, and I got a text message or phone call from my bank asking me about the transaction. And when I looked at the message, I thought, I probably need to call the bank directly rather than try to, hit the number in here. I mean, it's those types of things. It's like that societal implications of these things that we have to all embody and talk about quite often. And then at the same time, be looking at technology solutions that really drive the cutting edge. It's an escalation of arms. And also be smart about like legislation and things like that are really targeting keeping companies like ours moving forward to be able to combat these problems while also respecting consumers and their privacy and their rights around their data.
Yeah, and I'd emphasize that Tim, I really agree with you. That the thing that concerns me the most is not fraudsters attacking corporations or financial institutions like mine. We're expecting to be attacked, right? This is something we're planning for and preparing for every day, and have lots of different layers at which we try to prevent that from happening, and preventing consumer harm or preventing financial harm to the corporation. The thing that we have already seen can be effective and unexpected. It's probably part of the reason that it becomes so effective is that consumers don't know or aren't broadly educated about these techniques yet. And it is fraudsters attacking consumers directly, pretending to be a family member, a known corporation, a friend, and using that to then go on and commit fraud is the thing that I think is the big vulnerability. And maybe that is solved through credentials or passkeys or better encryption, so that consumers know when they are working through devices or working electronically, whether they can verify the authenticity of the person. On the other hand, is this really my dad or my son? Is this really the company that I know? Right? What are the methods that I can use to know either how to receive a message securely or how to send a message securely, regardless of whether that's phone, video, or whatever else.
Yeah, I tell you, I've got a couple of crypto accounts, Coinbase and a couple others, and it's amazing to me how often I get a phone call. It happens pretty much daily, where I get a phone call from saying, "Oh, this is Coinbase calling. We need, someone's tried to withdraw crypto, or whatever." And it's just amazing that that obviously it's working, I guess, because they keep doing it. I mean, it's happened. It probably averages daily for the last 6 months.
Yeah, the social engineering aspects here, I think, it's effective, right? Plays on people's emotions,
right?
It's unexpected, and that to me feels like the hardest problem to solve.
Yeah.
If you have a half hour, I highly recommend anybody that I know watch the John Oliver episode on pig butchering.
Oh, yeah, I'd watched that.
It is unbelievable that the scale of these operations and what they do to defraud consumers.
It is amazing, and that's where I learned a lot from that episode. And there's also a book called, I think, Number Go Up. It's a crypto book by a Bloomberg author who details. He actually visited the places that John Oliver was talking about. He actually physically went to visit them in Cambodia. It's just fascinating story.
The scary thing is that the threats can come from all over the place. I mean, it's, whether it's a call center that has access to sensitive PII in another country that's harvesting that data to launch attacks on individuals. Like, I think there was a series that focused on that specific attack with, basically like a lottery scam. You call up and be like, "Hey, you've won a new Mercedes," typically targeting people who have lost a spouse or a partner. So they're in a tight or difficult emotional state, and they think they've won this prize, and then they're like, "Oh, well, you got to pay the tax on it. So, wire us $10,000." And that's all of a sudden you find yourself there. And then now imagine that's happening from a trusted voice or a trusted face.
Right.
So that's where it gets really scary.
That's scary. I like the safe word thing. I think we're gonna do that in our family, because if you can start to mimic voices, because they're dialing in all the time now. Anyway, we should get to audience questions now. Let's first, we touched on passkeys, but there's a question here about it. Do you see a future that incorporates the passkey technology that Visa publicly announced last week?
I think it's a great question. Yes, I think when we talk about this from Prue's perspective, we really talk about our ability to bind an identity to passkeys, and the power that binding has when you're using that passkey as an analog for you and your identity, and you're asserting that subsequently. And I think it plays very well in the payment space. So, being able to unlock and use payments in merchant checkout flows and things like that from a passkey that's bound to your device, has some provenance of that identity. I absolutely do think there's a world for that, and I think it's going to be really. But when I think about this, I look at it not just from a payments perspective, but also from a hyper personalization perspective and what that means. My expectation is that the availability from that passkey to be able to drive insights, customer insights to relying parties, or imagine a crypto account, for instance, who is interested in understanding who's visiting them, that maybe falls within a certain range of financial wherewithal. You could target specific consumers, obviously with their consent, they have access to this data, but target specific consumers around, do I offer them sign up bonuses? Are there things that I can sweeten to get more traffic coming through my platform and buying more crypto, those types of things. I think the world is not just about, when I think about identity and binding, and identity is cool, but I think what you can do from a bound authenticator to do things like enable payments and enable, seamless checkout, enable personalization of experience on the web. That's when it gets really fun and exciting to me.
Yeah, I certainly see a world in which, right, passkeys are already part of our world and part of what we do, and there may be more of that. Although, right, I'd certainly say that passkeys still have weaknesses, and right, passkeys are still credentials. Credentials can be leaked and discovered, and at least biometric-based passkeys are hard to replace, hard to rotate those credentials, whether it's your fingerprint or your retina or your face or whatever else. It is, at the end of the day, a credential and a set of data that can be replicated, and where it also probably brings up some other questions, or at least for me personally, from a personal safety or even potentially civil liberty standpoint of, right, those are things that enable non-consensual identification of, right, if I can control your physical person, then I have your credential in a way that other credentials don't unlock.
Interesting. Okay. Next question. What details are important to consider when trying to determine if an image is real or AI generated?
This is a fun one. This is a tough one. And right, if you like rewind 5 years ago to the set of answers that you would give, like they would all be comical and beat now. So these are all things that I don't expect will stay this way for long, as this continues to evolve and get better. And we've talked about the liveness detection, right, which is usually some form of like blood flow detection, right? You're looking at PPG. I'm not going to try to pronounce that word. I never remember how to say it, but right, that's one way you can look at these things. You're looking at image texture and edges. Lighting sources, another one we've talked about in these videos. You're going to look to identify the source of the lighting and if it's consistent. There are approaches with temporal approaches, right? Video is a set of frames, right? Is the image consistent? Frame to frame. Camera footprints is another really good idea that I don't know who to credit, but someone had this really good idea of, if you know what the device is, you know what the camera's on it, basically all cameras are going to leave some sort of unique trace about that image. And, a really simple example of that would be something like, if I'm seeing standard def video from a high def camera, that seems odd. Like that's probably not the right thing, but there's a lot about the edges of the image and things like that can go on. And then, right, there are also aspects of the right image or video or audio files themselves about what's the provenance of the file, how was it created, how was it delivered, that are not in the data itself, but are part of the metadata that are included along with it.
Okay, if you have a question for our experts here, now is the time. We are going through the questions that we've received here. Another one here: what impact do regulations have on deepfakes and AI?
There's not, at least from a financial services perspective, there's not a lot there yet. I think that lots of regulators are looking at that currently, and they've certainly voiced their concerns. But I think that the nature of this evolution is just moving so fast and at a pace that is a little bit unrealistic to expect, regulations to be at the front of. I think that it's up to us as consumers and as companies to be able to stay up with this question, and then hopefully as time goes on, we'll get to a point where regulations or just our general education and experience as individuals will help to reduce this as an issue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Next one. What's the role of biometrics, and what's the role of decentralized identifiers, DIDs? Tim, do you want to take that? And maybe you can explain what is a decentralized identifier?
Sure. First of all, hopefully I had a little internet problem there, hicked up. So
I
hopefully
saw you froze briefly, but you look like you're back now.
okay. Yeah, actually one of the I didn't catch all of Jason's answer. I just wanted to touch on, there have been a spate of regulations at the state level that have come out over the last couple of years that are very interested in, specifically focusing on consumers' ability to opt out of AI training. I think that's really interesting. I think it's a net positive move in general from a consumer privacy and safety perspective. I worry they could have some unintended consequences, like you opting out of from a trust and safety perspective, or just from an identity verification perspective, if those models are being used to help augment the ability to identify somebody, and you opt out of it, it has the potential to kind of expose you a little bit. So we'll wait and see about how that's going to go. So decentralized identifiers. So there's a lot of talk about what I would say more broadly verified credentials, and the idea is really to push your identity data, your ownership of your identity data onto your device, and then put you in control of the release of that information, as opposed to having a central authority release that data about you. The overarching goal there is to try to say, look, when I may have the classic example of this is I get a diploma and from a college or university. If I had a decentralized identifier or a verified credential wallet on my phone, this diploma and my GPA and all the course history and everything could be pushed down to my phone. It would be signed by the university, and the public key for that data signature would exist typically they talk about on the blockchain, but it could be in a public database, it could be anywhere, it could put it on a website for all it matters. When I go to get my first job, my first job was at IBM. I walk into IBM employment office, rather than them say, hey, go back to the registrar's office at your university, ask them to send us an embossed copy of your transcripts, and it's sealed in an envelope, and then we get it a week later and we tell you whether we believe you or not. I can share the data on my verified credential with IBM, and then they can validate that it came from my university by checking the signature on the data against the publicly available key, private, or the public key for the university. So conceptually, you expand that out into the world of identity. So I go off and I go through a document verification flow, and I do a background check. Now that data ends up on my verified credential on my phone. It's been signed by an issuing authority. Maybe that issuing authority is a company like Prove, or it's a bank or some entity out there. Now, whenever I show up, I'm able to go and push that data and share that data with the certainty that it came from that issuing authority. In the U.S., it's interesting. Verified credentials have long been sort of this holy grail for people who are really pushing towards self-sovereign identity, which is put the consumer or the individual in complete control. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think in the U.S. especially, this will mostly manifest as a mobile driver's license. We're seeing that being pushed out in a number of different states here, and they're tied off to the OEM wallets. I think those make the most sense. The biggest challenge we have with verified credentials is, do you really want another app to download onto your phone? And then when do I use that? Oh, I use this verified credential app, this verified credential wallet to do one thing, and then I go and I do it. If I use my mobile driver's license for another thing, it's just it puts a lot of market confusion in play. And I think that realistically in the US, we'll probably see more of a market share taken in that space from things like mobile driver's license. Now, in the EU, the EU is mandating the issuance of state issued, very similar to mobile driver's license, but it's a state issued verified credential wallet essentially. So that data will reside in their very specific use cases that they're targeting for its adoption. So I think there are instances globally where it's happening. I think in the US, it'll be more slow adoption, or it'll be very specific targeted areas, overshadowed by mobile driver's license.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, mobile driver's licenses, I'm in Colorado. We're one of 4 states, I believe, that Apple has approved for mobile driver's licenses. The trouble is, like, I tried to use it when I was flying earlier this month, and went to TSA in Denver, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, I had one of those last week," and it just he couldn't get it to work. Like I tried to put it to the device that was supposed to recognize. He says, "Do you have your real license?" And so it's we're not quite ready for prime time yet.
Yeah, and to me that's the go ahead, Tim.
Go ahead, no, Jason, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just saying, to me that's the really interesting part. Like I love the principles behind
Me too.
these IDs, but right, the question of like, what are we going to discover as we use them, and what are some of the pros and cons of them? But there's also adoption in terms of, well, for this to be a real thing, you have to have a certain nucleus to adopt, and then also, who are you leaving behind with this, right? This is something that as a app focused, web focused, finance company that we run into quite frequently is, right, we don't just want to serve people with Apple iPhones. And so, right, what does that mean about your ability to really serve, all people, and not create more friction or leave people behind? And to me, that's where it becomes the principles are great. The practice, I think, is difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Jason. I think we already have a world where there is a marginalized portion of the society that already have hard time getting physical ID. Then you're introducing this as the primary mode of identification. It can be challenging. And we run it, and it's not just an ID either. We run into underbanked, underserved populations all the time. It makes it introducing something like this and expecting it to be ubiquitous is a challenge. And then on top of that, it's I love it. I worked on previous employers spent a lot of time working on mobile driver's license, and watched it. We rolled it out in Delaware, rolled it out in Oklahoma, but it was always the same question. So we go talk to a national brand and say, "Hey, look, this is really cool. We've got this mobile driver's license," and they would say, "Okay, you've rolled it out in Oklahoma and Delaware. What about California and Texas, Florida, New York, the big states?" And so when you're talking to a car rental company, that's like, "Okay, come back to me when you've got 85% or higher, 80% higher adoption, and you cover a majority of the country," that's when it gets interesting to me. And I think that coupled with the challenges around technology and standardization, standardized ways to get access to it in a way that is not reliant on third-party integrations and things like that starts we have sometime over a coffee. I can talk a little bit about how some of the work that's going on and why it potentially benefits different players in the market versus some of the upstarts that are happening.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question here. Jason compared face and other biometric captures as being replicated like passwords, but if someone's genuine biometric template is safely stored, isn't the onus on the technology to verify that identity, i.e. a genuine biometric is unique? Is it not down to the sophistication of the technology to read it rather than password that truly is replicable?
Yeah, so if I understood that question, right, I think I generally agree that Ultimately, as long as the technology you're using to read and store that information is secure, you're good to go and it works. Unfortunately, we know that right, all the different methods of transmission encryption we've come up with have been beaten at some point by someone for some reason via some method. And so when data like that, when the cat's out of the bag, I think that right permanently removes that in a way, that option in a way that's different than a password. And that would be my right main concern or point. Not that it isn't something you can't do, but right, if that part ever fails, you're faced with a problem. I think one of the avenues that's potentially interesting for these more biometric based passwords is kind of taking the salt and pepper kind of approach to passwords of like, oh, I can have a biometric step and I can have a PIN step, or combining those things so that even if one part is exposed, the whole thing isn't. So there are probably different routes that we could approach to using biometric fingerprints, for lack of a better term, in combination with other methods, so that even when those credentials are, exposed, that you can still reuse that component of the credential.
Yeah, and I would add there, I think this has long been a concern of biometric usage of biometrics. So I didn't really talk about it. My background goes back to the mid-90s for working for a biometric company. And we've long been the common refrain we've always heard or had heard was, what happens if somebody gets my template or gets my fingerprint image or my palm image or my face image, then what, right? And there have been many ways that have been tried and approached to solve that problem. I mean, there was a lot of work done at the university level back in the mid 2000s that looked at using image-based seeding and things like that to try to break up the template. So if you did steal it, it would be basically useless, because you'd still needed the seed to kind of reconstruct what actually, then to subtract out the seed. It was interesting. I have a close friend of mine who runs a company today that does basically decentralized template matching for biometrics. So it takes the template, breaks it up, never brings them back together. So the technology is being employed to go through the matcher technology, is actually leveraging the power of the nodes to do the matching, as opposed to reconstituting it in one place where it could potentially be taken or walked off with. So there are technology solutions to some of these things, but it's like anything. I think it gets back to your standard sort of CISO stuff, where you're protecting the data, you're protecting your fort to prevent from penetration and prevent from data theft and things like that.
Okay, well, I think we've run out of time. We're gonna have to leave it there. So first, I want to say thank you, of course, to the audience for tuning in and for your questions. Thank you very much to Tim and Jason for your expert advice there. And of course, thank you to Prove for sponsoring this webinar and making it possible. So with that, I will wish you a good afternoon. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay, see ya.